story of classical guitar in Canada.
L'histoire de la guitare classique au Canada. Welcome to episode number 2 of the story of classical guitar in Canada. We started with Patrick Roux because he is my main influence and the part of the story I know really well. Episode number 2 is kind of the other side of the coin, my other really big influence, not somebody I studied with, but somebody I worked with in very formative years for me. I'm talking, of course, about legendary classical guitarist Philip Candelaria. So this conversation was recorded in late July, early August of 2020. I know I'm taking a lot of time getting things out to you. Anyway, COVID was still sort of a thing. We were distancing, so the recording took place at Phil's home in Arnprior, Ontario, but we were outside. You'll hear the birds and the cicadas to prove it. And we talk about his start in the guitar. We talk about his undergraduate degree. Please pay attention. That's an interesting story. And also his graduate degree and sort of the career highlights that followed. Phil's story is a really interesting one for the classical guitar in Canada. He's very much a trailblazer. He sort of figured out his path into classical guitar before there was a path to follow. He talks about the wonderful things that were the Toronto Guitar Festivals, especially Guitar 75. He talks about his time in the Canadian Guitar Quartet. We talk a lot about the fact that it was his idea in the first place, and many, many other things. Many interesting people get mentioned throughout. So please enjoy this conversation with classical guitarist Philip Candelaria. So let's start at the beginning. Where did music and the guitar specifically enter your life?
Okay, well, if I go back to the very beginning, I was fortunate to have parents that were both really into music. My mom was a piano teacher, neighborhood piano teacher, and quite a good pianist. She gave a number of concerts in her day. And then my father was a composer, mainly. He fiddled around pretty well at the piano. He wrote most of his music at the piano. But he also directed a band, an orchestra, if you will, in the Korean War. He was in the U.S. military service. And sort of to get out of going to the front and fighting, he said, "Hey, I can do music. I can direct the band here at home."
And where did his training come from? Just self-taught?
Well, he was mostly self-taught. He just adored music his whole life, and when he was in the army, he developed his skills, directed the orchestra, wrote a lot of music, did a lot of arrangements, some of old ones that I've found that are pretty cute. And to make a story a little shorter, he decided at one point he couldn't make a living as a musician and raise a family. He didn't think he had the chops on the piano to perform. He probably rightly thought, well, composing is going to be a meager source of income. So he went into academia, became a professor of English, and I was born while he was finishing off his doctorate at Yale. So I had really supportive parents when it came to music. And so the beginning was my mom starting us off, my brother and I, very young. I think I was 3 or 4 years old, on the piano. That's what she taught. I did that for quite a few years, 5, 6 years, 7 years. And then I think it was around 8 or 9 when I just said, no, I don't want to go to piano lessons anymore. Rebelled, because the piano had been chosen for me. I didn't choose it as a young lad, but I'm glad they did that. Because we then did a very pivotal year in my life. We moved to Spain when I was 12 years old, and I hadn't been doing music now for a few years.
And you have, on both parents' side or just your dad's side that you have family in Spain?
My father's side. My father's name is Spanish, and my uncle lived there.
Right.
So we went there, but back to my mom, actually. My mom, who had just done piano all her life, decided, we're in Spain, the land of the guitar. I'm going to take guitar lessons. So she would bravely just drive herself once a week all the way to the capital of the province we lived in, Gerona. And she found a teacher there. And she had these lessons, and she was just really enjoying them.
And I've met your mom, and I can really imagine her having this really fearless is the word, but just I'm going to try something, and she would just try and engage with it just beautifully.
Yeah, she had definitely a real zest for life and for doing things, and being in Spain was inspiring. So one day she said, "Why don't you come with me to the lesson?" I said, "Sure, I've got nothing else to do. We're not going to go to the beach today." Yeah. So I went with her to a guitar lesson, and I sort of, I don't remember my reaction. But it was positive. And before I knew it, I was having my lesson after hers each week. We would drive together. And I took to it, and I think because it was my ask, I said, "Mom, can I continue with the lessons?" It was my choice that the guitar stuck with me.
So you really get to say you had your introduction to the guitar in Spain from a Spanish teacher.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it was pretty neat. And then we at one point, my folks said, "Okay, we are returning to Canada, so let's get you a good Spanish guitar, and you can continue in high school, studying the guitar." So they got my teacher's teacher, who was in Barcelona, the larger regional capital. We went down one day, and we went to a big luthier shop where they made guitars. It was called Estruc Guitars, and we thought, "Wow, this is really amazing." And this higher level teacher helped us pick out a guitar. So we went back to Canada with what we thought was a great Spanish guitar. My parents, put out the money to buy me, and I'm 12 years old.
Yeah.
And then we get to Vancouver, back home, and there was only really one guitar teacher of a higher level in the city at that time. This is 1968 or 9. I guess it's 1969, early days. And my mom and I both started taking lessons from him, and we soon found out that even though we had been in Spain, the land of the guitar, that my guitar wasn't actually all that great, and that a lot of the instruction I had actually wasn't really the state-of-the-art technique this teacher had studied with Bream at Stratford and in classes and knew a thing or two. He was a rough guy, though. I mean, my mom would come out of every lesson crying, and eventually couldn't take this guy's temperament. He was kind of a bad-tempered dude, and so she quit. But fortunately, I stuck with it, and I became, I think, probably his number one student, especially given my age.
Right.
I remember one time a field trip. We went down to Seattle to play for the Seattle Guitar Society, a little guitar society exchange. So I was 14, and I played Villa-Lobos Etudes for them, and I don't remember what else, but I remember playing a couple of Villa-Lobos Etudes, and these Seattle people were blown away that a kid this age could do that.
So it sounds a lot like the story of Julian Bream as a kid going to the London Philharmonic Society of Guitarists and playing stuff, and the people couldn't believe it,
Well, yeah, back in those days, there wasn't nearly the level.
Yeah.
So I probably got away with playing these things fairly badly, but it still kind of impressed people that a 14-year-old was doing this.
Well, I think there's a certain point, too, in these stories where if you can just make it from the beginning to the end of your piece.
That's right.
That was kind of impressive in those days.
That's right. So fast forward a few years, I managed to deal with this rather difficult teacher all the way through high school.
Would you say it's sort of just you just liked the instrument and the playing of it so much you didn't care if the teacher wasn't that great a mix for you or something?
Well, it was that I was his star student, so he was actually probably nicer to me than pretty much anyone else. And although he would not, when it came time for me to go to university, I had so much positive reinforcement, I decided, I'm going to audition on guitar. He wouldn't write me a letter of recommendation. So anyway, to get past him, I guess I was lucky that I did go on a couple of local Kiwanis festivals that were just starting to allow guitar to be, a participating instrument. And I did well, and I was encouraged, so I auditioned on the guitar at UBC for music. So this is 1973 or 2, somewhere in there. And they said to me, we don't offer guitar as a major. I said, really? That's my instrument. Yeah, but, we don't, we have piano major, we have, established instruments, but guitar is not a major. But you could be a history major. I said, oh, okay, because you can concentrate, you can have lessons on guitar. So that was kind of an interesting thing for me because I wanted to be a guitar performance major.
Right. There's a little bit of a Julian Bream parallel here again, right? That's his. I forget if it's in the Royal Academy or the Royal College of Music. I never.
I think it was with the Royal College, yeah.
But
yeah.
He studied piano and cello and just
That's right.
kept doing guitar on the side.
You know, and this is what did we say, 72?
Yeah.
A lot of universities were just starting to get into the idea of having guitar programs.
Yeah.
So something I'm very proud of is that when I got to my third year as a music history major, I said, I'm going to pretend I'm a performance major in guitar and give my third year, my junior recital. And I invited my profs, and it wasn't the pressure of a recital that's being graded. I did it purely as an exercise to say, hey, guitar can be a performance instrument too, And the teachers really were impressed. I remember doing the Britain Nocturnal and some and Polifemo de Oro. I was a real Bream fan, so I had those two pieces on from his 20th Century Guitar album. And then in fourth year, I said, I'm going to do it again. I'm going to do a fourth year senior recital, not for credit. I put the Hans Werner Henze Memorias del Cimarron on that one, and a bunch of my favorite Renaissance lute music that I transcribed, and some Francesco da Milano, and I forget what else. The Orbon Prelude and Dance. So some significant music, and again, the profs that I'd invited said, this is great. And so...
Who was the guitar teacher at the time?
Well, that's another story. Yeah, I had the first year I was there, we had a fellow who was a disciple. I don't remember his name. He was a disciple of Tomas in Spain, Segovia's right-hand man for so many years. And that was good because he was all about sound, and he brought Jose Tomas over for some master classes.
Wow. Oh,
and that was...
Because you and I have talked about all of these things before in some form or another, but I don't think I remember that bit of the story. That's really exciting.
It was very good for me. I think it was, looking back, an introduction to, the higher levels of the world of guitar.
God, yeah.
But that teacher also was a little bit limited in some ways, and actually the students at one point rebelled and said, we don't want this teacher anymore, we want somebody. And they got a fellow named Bruce Clausen who had gone away and studied and come back and was much more modern in his approach. And I finished off my bachelor's taking lessons from him, but my degree was in music history. Now the important part of this story, I think, is that the year after I left, there are now more and more people applying to music wanting to be guitar majors, and they said, well, look at this Candelaria guy. He did these recitals. They were high level. The literature was there. Let's bring in a performance major in guitar. And so it was sort of, looking back, I said, I think I was part of that decision. And also another high-level teacher had moved to Vancouver. Michael Strutt had moved to Vancouver, and he had studied with Bream and brought a much stronger pedagogical background.
Right. And I think too
that
like,
helped.
You see the difference in these stories when somebody's teaching and doing as well as they can, but then you get somebody else who comes to town and he's teaching, but he wants to build something in that town.
Yeah, Michael was very positive, and he could play like Vancouver had not seen a guitarist that could play at that level up to that point. Yeah. So he had an impact. And then a few years after that, Harold McKay moved to Vancouver. So we started to develop a higher level of performance and teaching. But at that point now, I had left. I went down to Seattle and participated in a master class that was given by Aaron Shearer. They had brought him in, and I had a scholarship to go, and it was all very interesting.
So I remember on one of our quartet tours, we met a fellow. We were somewhere in, I think it was in Georgia, but it was on that tour that we played in Georgia. And there's a guy who was like the local teacher, and he said, "Oh, this is the guy. He had he come to Vancouver or something like that? But that's where you first saw one of
I know who you're thinking
students.
Of.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. And that was sort of what got you started, knowing there was this opportunity to go study with Shearer.
You're thinking of Christopher Berg.
That's right. Yeah.
Christopher Berg was in South Carolina, Columbia.
Right.
And that was on that same tour when we played in Mississippi and all those places.
Yeah.
And Christopher Berg came with Aaron Shearer. That's a good point.
Yeah.
He came with him to Seattle, and he played a recital, and I had never seen someone so young, he was just finishing his bachelor's at that time, playing so clean and at such a high level, and I was really excited about that. So Aaron Shearer invited me to come study with him at the Peabody, which is where he was.
Right.
And that was the same year that Johns Hopkins University bought Peabody and kind of rescued it financially. Right. So I wound up going to Peabody at a kind of a crucial time in its history and studying with Aaron Shearer a total of almost 3 years. And he really cleaned up my technique, and he also gave me a lot of valuable teaching information. I think he helped me become a good teacher as much as a better player.
Right.
And so that was instrumental. And so when I went from finishing at Peabody, what was interesting is while I was there, last couple of years, a Canadian guitarist that I had met at some competitions, Norbert Kraft, he came down to Peabody and he wanted to get his technique cleaned up too. This is what Shearer was known for, you know. And so we became really, really good friends. And Norbert every time I would head to Toronto, I would stay with Norbert, and Norbert was very outgoing and friendly and nurturing, and we were supportive of each other. And this was just probably a year, this was 2 years after probably the most important event in my whole career, which was Guitar 75.
Right.
And Guitar 75, I'm sure everybody knows now, was one of the first, probably the first really big international guitar festival in Canada, and was actually, at that time, worldwide, there weren't that many of these things. You know, now there's a plethora.
Not that Drew. Do you know what the plethora is?
Yeah.
Like, that's one thing I talked to Ellie about when I talked with him, and when I talked with Denis Poliquin, he had the same thing. I don't think he went to 75. He went to maybe the next one, 78.
78, yeah.
But he was saying, like, what it meant. Like, you're studying in your little corner of the world, and I mean, your story is really cool because you already have Spain, Vancouver, and Baltimore, and all the currents that, you know, you'd seen a variety of currents already. You know, a lot of people, like, my career was pocketed to one little, or my studies were pocketed to one little area, one main teacher. And, you know, the world is now that you can have influences just coming in all over the place. But, like, your variety of influences. But even then, you go to this international guitar festival.
Yeah, it was amazing. It really was. It blew my mind. And I was home for the summer from Peabody, and I think it was in June or July, I can't remember. But it was like a pilgrimage. A friend of mine who was going there too, we decided to drive across Canada. We were poor young students. Let's drive across. We're going to sleep in the car, alternate driving. We get to Toronto. We're so exhausted we fall asleep in the car, just parked on the side of the street. We get up the next day and we start going to this festival. And I met Leo Brouwer there, who gave an amazing concert. I had never seen anything like it. And I studied in the classes with him. And I was starting to learn, and I had played El Cimarrón. Right. So I played that for him, and that really impressed him, and I played some of his own music. And I think also, looking back, as you know, one of the key moments in your career, you know, on a whim, I submitted a tape, and in those days it was literally a reel-to-reel tape. Okay. I sent it to Ellie Kasner in Toronto, and I said, I'm from the West Coast, you want to have, they were doing these noon hours, for showcasing Canadian guitarists, and it was quite competitive to be selected for one of these noon hours. So Ellie listened to my tape and he loved it, and I played some Brouwer on it, and he said, yeah, you can have one of these noon hours. We split them between two guitarists, share a noon hour. And so,
do you remember who was your shared stage?
Who shared? No, I don't remember. The second one I remember, I shared with Norbert Kraft.
Oh, that's
in 78. But in 75, no, I don't remember. But I do remember that it went really well. I played the Brouwer, I played the Henze. Brouwer came up to me after that concert and said, "Bravo," you know, and
you can retire after that.
I mean, I was on cloud nine I was about 20 years old, and I felt that. It turned out, it was true, this was kind of an opening. So many people from the States and so forth saw me play that noon hour that I actually started getting invitations. So I played at a festival in the States the next year in 79.
Were you still after that summer, did you still have time at Peabody, or were you finished by then?
No, I was right in the middle of Peabody.
Okay.
So I went back to Peabody, did another year, and then I remember seeing Brower in the '75 concert. He did the world premiere of a piece called Contrasts by John Weinsweig, and big name Canadian composer, the dean of Canadian composers. And I remember thinking, well, that's an interesting piece, but I'm not understanding everything that he's doing with that. And so I got the score from the Canadian Music Centre, and I started getting into it, and I started seeing, okay, now I get it. And I went to Toronto on a trip. I think it was in a competition, and that's right, I was in the national finals of the Stepping Stone one,
Right.
the Canadian music one, and in the age category. And I was staying at Norbert's, and I played Contrasts for Norbert. Norbert said, you know what, John Weinsweig lives just a few blocks away. Why don't you go and play this piece for him? And that hadn't occurred to me. I was young. I didn't know.
That's like one of those stories, somebody in Paris, Franz Liszt, I know him.
Yeah,
He lives down the street. Let's go see him.
And I thought, oh, he's not going to want to hear me play this. And Norbert said, no, you don't know composers. He's going to love the fact that you're playing his piece. He's going to...
Yeah.
So anyway, I go to John Weinsweig's house. I play Contrasts for him. I got so inspired playing this piece for the composer that I actually busted a nail. I was so into this piece, playing it for him. But he liked what I was doing, and he invited me to record the piece the next year for Sonordisc, which was a label devoted to Canadian music, run by the Canadian Music Centre, I think, with money from Factor and other government agencies. So it was a kind of a big deal for a young guy to get invited to make this recording. So I go back to Toronto, and recorded this piece, which was an interesting experience because I was so young. I really didn't know in those days how to prepare for recording. So I think it's honest to say I really was unprepared. But I managed to get through it, and I had a really nice producer in Cyril Glick, and Weinsweig was there, and we put this thing on vinyl in those days. Wow. It was on vinyl.
And what at this point? 20 what at this?
21 or 2. Yeah. Wow. And so that was kind of another milestone, I think, for me.
Because the scene now is, at 21 or 22, you're not an adult in the guitar world yet, because there's so much to learn, and people are doing their doctorates, and, at 21 or 22, sort of like, in the 1800s, at 22, you're starting to be old a little bit, because you only lived 35 years.
Well...
But,
yeah, and I have to say, I think we've talked about it, is in those days, there wasn't nearly the level, and there wasn't nearly the sheer number of really amazing guitarists and good training that's now available everywhere.
I think the word critical mass applies here.
Yeah.
It's another world entirely. Even in my, I'm 15 years younger than you are, and the transformations I've seen in my time are huge, too.
Yeah, it's exponential now.
Yeah.
And I think in those days, it takes a little bit away, but to be honest, I think in those days I could do these things at a lower standard than would be allowed today. So, I was really barely prepared to do this recording, but it came off, and they didn't have anybody else to do it. So that recording later, they did reissue it as a CD. And around that time, I was finishing up at Peabody, and I met another Canadian guitarist that came down from Toronto to get his technique cleaned up with Shearer. And that was, again, another really pivotal thing for me. His name was Bob Hamilton. And Bob stayed with me like Norbert had stayed with me in Baltimore. And Bob said, there's this college up in Sudbury where I teach. They fly me in once a week to teach. I spend a night in a motel. I teach the next day. They fly me back. And they said they're getting tired of all this expense of flying me and feeding me and hoteling, and they want to hire me full time. And he said, but I'm not going to take the job. And I said, why wouldn't you take a full-time gig in guitar? That's a pretty rare thing these days. He said, well, I've just formed a duo with Richard Bradley, a very talented Sudbury guitarist who went on to study with Norbert Kraft and won the Canadian Nationals at one point. And Bob was so excited about this duo, and he was a very well-known teacher for the Royal Conservatory in Toronto.
No, still is, really.
Yeah, he still is. And
we owe the RCM's version of Spanish Romance.
That's right.
If nothing else.
And he's he's a career teacher, a wonderful guy, and he said, I'm not going to take this job. You should look into it.
Wow.
And I applied, and I understand there were over 100 applications. I think 125 is the number I heard for this job. But I was in a good spot because I was one of the few Canadians at that point to have a master's degree, which I got from Peabody. Sure, I finished it up.
Looks good, yeah.
Yeah. Johns Hopkins on the diploma, And I went up and auditioned, and I got this job. And I just am so thankful that I was in the right place at the right time to get this job, because it was a full-time teaching position with benefits and a pension at the end of it for guitar, a fairly rare bird even today. And it gave me the freedom to perform, because I didn't have to make my living from performing. I made my living teaching at this college. But they also recognized that going out and playing concerts was a good recruitment tool.
Sort of like,
and
let
me do it.
Having had the benefit of getting your job for 1 year when I was just starting out.
That's right.
Which was really good for me too, right? But it's like a university teaching gig. So the students you get aren't, it's a 3-year program, and they're not meant to be as high level. But it's without the pressures of being a university professor, because there are pressures, and there's committees, and there's publications, and this and that. And I didn't have to do any committees when I was at Cambrian because I was just there for the year. But there's got to be some, but still.
Yeah,
You tend to your instrument and your flock, and you go home.
Well, another difference for me there was that guitar, because of Bob's work, Bob Hamilton, and then I took up the baton and pushed guitar and went to local high schools and played and really did a lot on recruitment in the early days. And guitar became, at Cambrian College, the most popular instrument as a major.
And it still is.
And so because there were so many guitarists there compared to pianists and string players and even singers, that I didn't teach classes. I had to use all my time to teach one-on-one guitarists. Now the flip side of that, the good news is that gave me the freedom, because I could reorganize teaching single students fairly easily, as opposed to rescheduling a class. I could go off and play concerts all the time, and so I did. I went off and did a lot of solo touring throughout Canada, the States. I went to Europe on a sabbatical, actually. Studied in England with Gilbert Biberian, and I studied in New York with David Sterban and Sharon Isbin. And that year I decided to enter an international competition in France, and went there and won. I really didn't even expect to win, but I did. And that got a lot of good news coverage back in Canada, and again fed that career and got me a lot of performing. And I would say that was another sort of milestone event, going in a competition, because in those days competitions were considered a route to a performing career. Right. I think maybe less so now, although still important. And
just before we kind of leave Peabody fully behind, I always like in these, it's name dropping, of course, but just some of the colleagues you have there who people might know a few names.
Oh yeah.
So you arrived when Manuel Barreco had just left.
That's correct.
He had just graduated, so you weren't a colleague of his there.
He was gone, but I met Manuel, and we became good friends for a time.
Yeah.
Just sharing the Shearer experience, which with its good and bad aspects, and good friends with Christopher Berg and a number of other well-known guitarists. David Sterban was a previous graduate, so I later studied with him.
Yeah.
And so being at Peabody, looking back, I think was one of the best times of my life.
It was a hotbed for future leaders in North America of the guitar scene.
Shearer was a powerful influence, but I learned as much, I would say, by going to master classes by Leon Fleischer, the famous pianist
who passed away just 4 days ago.
Yeah, pretty recent.
92.
Yeah, he was very powerful influence on me, even though he didn't know me from. I'm just a guitarist attending his piano master classes, but I watched a master teacher and learned so much. And we had visitors. We had Aaron Copland. We had We had Isaac Stern give our convocation address. We had George Crumb came in and gave a
Wow.
class one time, and I remember listening to this fellow. I couldn't believe how he spoke. It was like an encyclopedia speaking. No, I'm sorry. I'm mixing him up with who's that serialist? That Milton Babbitt. That's
okay.
who I'm thinking. Milton Babbitt gave a class, and this man sounded like an encyclopedia. And I think it's the first time I ever watched a score while a piano piece of his was being played and got lost. Watching
Yeah,
a score.
I've been in that situation too. It's like, thank God there's a trill over here because I just, you
Oh,
know.
there were so many tessitura. Anyway, yeah, Peabody was wonderful. Great experience. So, not only for those teachers and for Aaron Shearer, but meeting Norbert Kraft and then meeting Bob Hamilton, which led to a wonderful career teaching at a college.
Right.
As you say, without the academic pressures, it was more of a...
And that's a big part of your story in classical guitar too, is Phil, the teacher at Cambrian. Like, if you just had to throw a number, how many guitarists do you think you taught at Cambrian over the years?
Oh, you know, it's...
Let's say 12, an average of 12 per year.
oh, more.
For how
than
many
that.
years?
Yeah, no, it was usually... I started at around 25 students
Okay.
the first couple of years, and then we got a workload formula that through striking that made that a little more sane. And so most of my career there was an 18-hour teaching week.
Right.
Was the magic number, but that included a couple of classes that I taught. So I was averaging around 14, 15 students a year
for
for 31 years.
31 years. And
Yeah.
okay, let's just, like, people can figure out the numbers, but it's not 14, it's not 14, 15 new students every year because they're there for, if they stay the 3 years, they're there for 3 years, but still, that's a huge amount of people. And, in the time I've known you, I've met people, I took lessons with Phil back in the it's a huge part, too, of giving back to the community. And, the college program, not that many of them stay in classical guitar the rest of their lives.
Right.
Some will as hobbyists, and some stay in a career, but still the richness that you've imparted to all these people over the years. I mean,
Well, and I think another significant thing about the college program is that we were the only place, maybe still is, in Ontario, where you could go to study classical music and not have the background that a university would require. So I wound up being a kind of a prep program for a lot of university programs. And I started, I had met Patrick Roux
right.
through, I think it was initially, I shared a place with him in Calgary when he was invited as a previous winner
Well, I can
to come out and play a concert.
me with my memory, I can tell you a story when you would have known of him earlier than that, and that's the second GFA in Quebec City. Because you wrote an article that was published in Soundboard that mentioned him as one of the finalists.
Okay, I forgot. Yeah, I was asked to do some reviews for that one.
That's my job. It's memory, right?
Right.
That's why I'm doing these interviews, right? It's part of what I love about hearing the stories and then remembering. Oh, that's right, so and so.
Well,
Adam Holzman once told me that blah blah blah, and he's a good storyteller too, right? So that's when he and Patrick sat down this one time. He says, Patrick, the last time we met, is it what I'm thinking of? And yeah, it was 83 in Quebec
I think
City.
that was when Adam won the GFA.
That's right.
That's right.
The very second one.
That's right, and it was in Canada, so of course I was there and taking it all in, and Patrick, who became a very important influence in my life and colleague, and was your teacher, and so meeting Patrick, sort of in midstream when I was at Cambrian, I started to want to send students to him, but at that time he wasn't teaching at the University of Ottawa like he is now.
Right.
And I remember sending a student named Jean Lafreniere, a very talented young man. He wanted to go to Ottawa to study, and I said, you want to go to University of Ottawa? Ask them if they will let you study with Patrick Roux, who wasn't on faculty at that time. So Jean went to University of Ottawa. He asked for Patrick Roux specifically. They decided to take him up on that. They hired Patrick, and Patrick then came to Ottawa U to teach my guy, and went on to develop a really strong program.
Well,
there.
it was good timing too, because I was sort of I was still a student of Patrick's at the Conservatoire at that time, but looking back, I can tell you kind of what happened is Ray Seeley, who's, you know, another big part of the story of classical guitar in Canada, he was kind of looking to pull back a little bit his duties as a part-time teacher at Ottawa to go to other things right around that time.
Okay.
So when they said, and then Laurie Burns was the chair of the music department at that point, who's married to John Armstrong, who's a guitarist, so she understands the world of guitar. So she was all about, you know, ready to open this up, and that's part of the story too, is people who will give guitarists a chance at universities and things like that. So she's, sure, let's hire Patrick, and then she kind of watched as Patrick got more and more students, and the level rose and rose and rose, and probably John was saying, my God, this Patrick guy, what he's doing to the students is impressive. So she really got behind and encouraged and really was very supportive of anything Patrick needed those years. And she still, I mean, she went off and did a few other positions at the university, but came back. And I mean, I'm telling part of the story, and it's supposed to be your story, but it's just to go into this pot of looking at the history of classical guitar in Canada. There's deans at universities who said, you know, sure,
Well,
I'll
like
give
it,
you a
yeah.
shot. Like, look, that's Shearer's story, right? Like, the people at Peabody said, we'd like you to teach here. And he says, I don't think guitar is ready to be at a university yet. And you said, well, because you believe that, we think you should then be the guy to do it here.
Yeah,
And they, you
and
know,
he wasn't even a performer. They just, yeah, and UBC deciding, yes, finally, to have a performance major. So, yeah, guitar was growing during these early years of my career, and it was fantastic to see. And the connection with Patrick was so good because the level at University of Ottawa in the guitar program came up and the numbers increased, and I just kept feeding students to the University of Ottawa. And then at one point, I was booked by one of the summer festivals in Ottawa to play a concert, and so I came from Sudbury, where the college was, to play a concert, and Patrick probably brought you to this concert, and came up to me after the concert, and he said, we really like what you're doing, you know, the way you play, your strong playing, and the repertoire. He said, why don't, he invited me to come give a master class at the Gatineau Conservatory, where he also taught. And I remember that's where I met you, because you came up and played a concerto for me that I didn't know, but somehow winged the lesson with you.
Oh, it was great. That's where I learned your up thumb backstroke thing that I still use. I was practicing yesterday, and I'm using it in a piece still.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
But I remember meeting a young Louis Trepanier in this class and saying to Patrick, wow, that's a strong student. So anyway, the connection with Patrick led to, a few years later, my deciding to start a quartet. And I said to Patrick, do you want to start a guitar quartet? And he said, that would be great. He said, I've already written a whole bunch of music for a guitar quartet. Who shall we have join us? And so we asked you, and as a young, strong student who had just graduated, I think?
Graduating.
Graduating.
We had our first rehearsal before I did my final recital.
Okay.
You know.
And then we cast around the net, so who will we have for our fourth? And we settled on another student of Patrick's, Dennis Donegani. So
actually, it's the other way around. Not to correct the guest speaker, but you guys had talked about it. You'd chosen Dennis already, and then the idea lay dormant for about a year and a half.
Oh, okay.
So the timing was good for me, because had you finished things then, it probably wouldn't have been me. I was still had a few more years to go. But then you brought the idea up again, and Dennis was still up for it. And there was just a good year for me, and then you...
Okay. Yeah, because Dennis is going back a long time.
But Dennis is 5 years older than I am.
Right.
And actually, that was one of the things I always liked about the quartet in the first lineup, is there's about a 5-year stretch exactly between each player. So we covered like this generational thing really well.
Well, those were great days. I remember when you guys... So we said, okay, what are we going to call ourselves? And... should we be the Ottawa Guitar Quartet? Yeah, but I live in Sudbury. And we settled on the Canadian Guitar Quartet, and I think we discovered there had been a group called that at one point, but they had long since disbanded. So the name was available. And so the CGQ was born, and I remember the first time the three of you came to Sudbury, and we read through some of Patrick's music. There was an instant...
It was fantastic.
...chemistry, and
because it's along the Sudbury-Ottawa Drive, or Ottawa-Sudbury, it's a 5-hour trek. So the three of us were in a car, and we talked the whole way there about, like, wow, what's it going to be like? And the way back, we just talked about how great it was. Like, wow, we're onto something here.
We're back in the last century, aren't we?
98.
98.
The spring of 98.
And looking back, you know, I think it was a decision Patrick and I made that to use students, former students of Patrick, made it kind of a family. Yeah. And it made it easy to communicate. And even though there were 3 of you in Ottawa, Gatineau, and I'm way over in Sudbury, we somehow made that work, that long commute. And I started teaching the odd time at the university, and became part-time faculty. And then we started touring. And I think another very interesting tie-in is that I had before the Canadian Guitar Quartet, around I forget, mid-90s.
Right.
I had another good career move. I played another festival in Ottawa with a lady who was organizing a tour of Jamaica, and she recruited musicians, and I got to play with Martin Beaver and the Morancy String Quartet and some really good musicians.
Some people, you know, beginners who who need a little help.
I remember Martin Beaver would just sight read these things that I was working on, and we would go and play these concerts. And we did a tour of Jamaica, and that was kind of my first international playing, except for the competitions I'd been in. And then another very interesting, completely serendipitous thing is that I met a Chilean immigrant to Canada, a fellow named Mauricio Montesinos, and he played cuatro, he sang, he played guitar, he zampoña, he could do a number of things, and he was a hit in Sudbury because he was playing these wonderful Latin arrangements and Nueva Trova, which were for social protest songs. And so I joined his band, and I became, I played synthesizer guitar to give him different sound effects, and rhythm guitar for him, and occasionally I'd get to do a lead, you know. Mm-hmm. And he at one point decided, we're going to go and play in Chile, my home country. So we worked for over a year, playing fundraising concerts. Finally, the big day arrives. We go to Chile. This is 1996. And we toured all over Chile, and we went into Argentina and played at a festival there. And I just fell in love with this country. And I decided to go back as a soloist, because while I was there, I noticed there's a fair bit of classical guitar going on in Chile. And I was more accomplished as a soloist at that point than a rhythm guitarist in a Latino band. Right. So we went back to Chile, and I met the some of the Chilean guitar teachers like Oscar Olson and Luis Orlandini and Eugenio Rodriguez, some of the bigger names teaching in the capital city, and played for them, gave classes for them, gave them my CDs. I had a couple CDs out by that point, and they invited me back several times to adjudicate, to be a featured performer at festivals, and that's where I met my wife, my Chilean wife, and who hired me for some extended tours.
You just brought me a great cup of coffee earlier.
There we go.
Right before the interview started.
And Chilean hospitality. So I sort of started a whole new part of my career performing in South America. And at one point, again, a serendipitous thing, there was a report sent out by the cultural officer at the Santiago Canadian Embassy mentioning all my activities in Chile, all these concerts and how well they were received. And a fellow named Laios Arendas saw this, who worked for the International Foreign Affairs, and he was in Guatemala at the time. And so he read this report. He said, well, we got to get this guy down here. So Laios brought me down a couple times to tour Guatemala, El Salvador, and I went into Costa Rica. And so then he moved back to Ottawa. They would rotate the diplomats. And then he wound up being in Lebanon.
Yeah, the middle. Actually, I was just talking about that with my wife, Catherine, last night with the bomb that just went, exploded in Lebanon. I was telling Catherine, and we can get there in a minute, but, you know, the tour that we never got to do because of 9/11.
That's right. Well, this is still back in, the 98, 99, 2000 area. And I just kept getting more and more work for Foreign Affairs Canada, and I got to go to a lot of different countries. And Laios was so wonderful, bringing me to Lebanon. I got to go into Damascus in Syria, played a concert at Amman in Jordan. I got to go to Petra, on my day off. I mean, that was my last big solo tour. That was 2001.
Right.
And at that point now, the Canadian Guitar Quartet is already really happening in a big way.
And I remember in the early years of the quartet, you were still, if I say it in a funny way, you were still, keeping illusions alive that you could maintain a solo career and the quartet. But it seems silly when you look at the amount of work we had to do. But it didn't seem silly at the time. It's a career you already have, and this quartet was going to be one part of it. But in a couple of years, it just became everything.
Yeah, that's right.
And the
right.
four of us, we really didn't do any other serious playing.
Yeah.
For the good 10 years outside the quartet.
Yeah, the quartet took over, and it was in totally with my blessing. And I felt the way Patrick said one time to me, he said, the Canadian Guitar Quartet was the crown jewel of his performing career.
Yeah.
And I was very excited about us because I could see we were doing as a quartet. We were playing at a higher level than I was playing as a soloist. But I had these contacts, these international contacts, and so I just was able to get that into the quartet.
Anybody who's
stream.
Listening to this podcast, who's a younger player, who's got career aspirations, find older players with mileage to be your partners, because you'll learn from them. You might have more energy, but they'll have it worked out for us. I mean, I remember the first tour we did in Calgary, in Calgary and Alberta. We did a bit where we went right through the Rockies. And I don't think Dennis had been in the Rockies before, because I just remember at one point he was just gazing up at the mountains as we were driving through Banff, and he just said, Phil, I'm really glad I know you, because it was your work and contact, because you had played all over Canada, so you were the one who would phone up these people, and they already knew who you were, and you said, got a group, and said, well, we liked your solo stuff, if you say your group's good, let's go, and that was a big deal of the quartet had its success from what it could accomplish on stage, which all four of us really can say we had a part in different kinds. Like, we all brought part of the alchemy to it, and we really melded well. But the business side of things, that really was just you. The other three of us, we always would say, thank God you're playing that part, because you play it so well, and I couldn't do it that well. Then whoever said that, somebody said, well, that other part, I'm glad you're playing that. Thank God you were there for the business side, because the other three of us, it's something we could have tried and sort of figured out, but you already knew it and you liked doing it. And that was a big part of the success, is somebody needs to be there figuring out itineraries and knowing,
And just writing grants. I mean, I had done so much work for international trade that I knew the system, and I knew how to apply for grants, and we had some success, and we built on that. Yeah, and I also felt that's my contribution, because here's Patrick writing all this great music that we get to play, and that gave us a special flavor, I think, that impressed a lot of other guitarists and a lot of people that were hiring us. We had this fantastic repertoire centered around Patrick.
It was music that, like, the serious musician would listen to and saying, this is really good music, and it's deep and it's worthy of my listening, and the complete person off the street would listen and go, oh, I get this music too. Like, it sort of straddles, it walks this tightrope of accessible yet not
trivial.
Not trivial. Actually, that's the best way I think we've ever described it.
Yeah.
Accessible without being trivial.
Yeah, it was not superficial, and I remember too hearing a lot of reactions from people that were not musicians saying, wow, I really like that music. It's exciting, it's rhythmic, it's complicated.
Everybody can relate to it. I think it comes from, I mean, we're getting off your story into Patrick's a little bit, but, at some point, when we've had the kind of collaborative careers, our stories really kind of intertwine, and you can't... Was it you who said this to the ambassador? Or was it
well,
me?
And we all did our part. I remember you and Dennis did a lot of the early arrangements of things that we performed, transcriptions, that gave us, again, a really nice, fresh repertoire that was dynamic.
You can't just play stuff people haven't heard yet and get the same kind of reaction. Like, you got the best new tune ever, people will like it. You got a pretty good tune they've heard many times, it's a classic of the classical repertoire. They'll react more strongly to that. They know it already.
Yeah.
So
I think we all did our bit,
Yeah.
and
Yes,
but
we
I
did,
remember
yeah.
I remember getting us a tour with a grant in Mexico, and then we went back to Chile several times because of
Yeah.
the connections there. And then, like you say, that tour that never happened was
Oh my God, that's
was
so sad.
yeah, we had this Middle East tour all lined up, and then 9/11.
Yeah, well, basically,
And-
it was what you had told me. It was a mirror of the one you had done as a soloist about a year and a half to 2 years before that, which was Lebanon, Syria, Jordan.
Yeah.
And on the way home from that, we were going to stop through the Canadian embassy and play in Athens.
In Greece, that's right. Now I think we were lucky. They wound up saying, okay, the money that's available for this tour, but you can't do it. We can give some of that to Brazil,
Right.
and that's how we wound up playing in Brazil and sort of being led around by Fabio Zanon, and doing our first
That was a great
tour in
trip,
Brazil.
too.
That was cool.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of wonderful memories that tie together. Patrick, University of Ottawa, me commuting from Cambrian, and I remember finally, I think it was about 2004 that I started part-time for University of Ottawa.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
But I told you guys, I have to finish off my career at Cambrian. I want to get to that pension I've worked hard for, and then I finally was able to retire after 31 years of teaching, and you're right. Along the way, the solo career that I thought was just going to blossom and go even further international got taken over by the quartet. But I was never happier because we had so much fun.
There's only so much time in a day to practice. And the thing is, if you're playing in a guitar quartet, you're playing kind of, let's call it easier repertoire with music in front of you. It's a different thing than the kind of serious big repertoire we were playing from memory.
Well, you remember that? You remember the transition from playing
Oh,
from
God.
music to memory? I think we did that in our second year
Yeah.
touring, and I think that's one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. It's one thing when you're playing a solo piece, you're playing the whole texture. That's relatively easy to memorize compared to if you're playing 1/4 of
Well,
a
it's-
piece and having to memorize all the little nuances that you bring to the quartet.
The toughest stuff is contrapuntal music when you're playing the third part. Like sort of the...
bass line of the Bach Sonata.
Well,
killed me.
actually, the bass line's sometimes easier because they sing more. But like the third part is like G, G,
Yeah.
F, G. Now, was that G, F, G, G? Oh, God.
Yeah, I watched my wife learning her alto parts, and they're way harder than the soprano parts because they rarely get melody.
Yeah.
So, yes, I remember we were so nervous that first concert we gave from memory, but we were inspired by the Assads, who were a huge influence, and to this day are my
Still.
favorite group,
Judy
guitar group to listen to.
Calperois, I've heard him say it in an interview, and he and I, when we hang out, we talk about other things too, but we talk about the Assads still a lot. And he says, there's a lot of guitarists and guitar music that I really loved when I was a kid, and he started playing really young. Like, he was taking lessons with Roberto Essel and Roberto's wife when he was like 10 and stuff, and he's known the Assads since then because they'd come to Paris and they knew this, the little kid who plays well,
Yeah.
And he says, it's pretty much only the Assads that I still like today with everything he's learned and he's achieved as much as he did when he was younger listening to them. And other people he's liked a lot when he was a kid, he listens back now and says, yeah, they're good, but it doesn't move me as much as it did then because I've grown, but these guys still.
Yeah,
And that
for me
was,
too.
And that was really our goal. Like, we talked about it a lot too. What we wanted to do, it was unachievable as a real goal, but we wanted to sort of be the guitar quartet that was doing what the Assads were doing, but with 4 guys.
Yeah, yeah, I remember that. And the move to memory was a big
Yeah.
part of that. And then one of the highlights of my Canadian guitar quartet career was when we got to work with the Assads.
Oh God, that was a nice.
And I think that was your doing. You
Yeah.
lined that up.
Yep, that was really nice.
And we had the connection with them through Fabio, who played with us. And
Yeah.
so there's, just so many highlights.
It's a really cool. Well, and that's one of the things that my performance career, which is the quartet really, has allowed me to do, is I got to know some of the guitarists who's that are heroes of mine.
Yeah, we met. Remember when we did one of the last Stetson International workshops that Stephen Robinson ran in Florida, and we got to meet Jason Vio.
Yeah,
and
Jason's still like he and I are in touch semi-regular. I wrote him when he won his Grammy. He says, Jason, now I can say I had a Grammy winner stay over in my place and that we watched a Muppet Show together,
Yeah, what a lovely man. And then, of course, he's been to Ottawa since
Yeah.
performing, and we met Adam Holtzman there. And
Eduardo Fernandez.
Eduardo
And,
Fernandez,
for me, it was
that's right.
meeting Eduardo and Oscar Gilia at that one. That was a bit like Oscar's patronage.
Oh, I still remember that concert, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I wound up later taking a lesson or two with Eduardo in Montevideo. I went all the way to South America on one of my tours. I was playing throughout Argentina.
Didn't you get to see the famous cathedral?
That's
of
right.
Barrios, and you say it's not that big?
No, it's not that impressive. I said, I have to go see the cathedral that inspired Barrios to write that piece, and it's pretty ordinary after seeing these massive Gothic cathedrals in Europe. No,
Actually, that's another really good Canadian Guitar Quartet tour memory is when we went to El Salvador, and God, his name's right now.
Carlos Paez.
Carlos, thank you. Yeah, Carlos took us out to see Barrios's grave.
That's right. That whole controversy about where should his tomb be.
Yeah.
El Salvador, Paraguay.
Yeah, and we got to put it. I got to put my hands on his grave, and it seems silly, but I just said thanks for all the music so when this is like a really side note, but when Catherine and I did a trip to Paris a few years ago, and you do all the cemeteries in Paris because oh my God, look at so and so. And we were the one day we were going to see Chopin's grave. Like, she's a pianist, and I said, when we get to Chopin's grave, you put your hand on the grave, you'll see there's something there, because I did it with our Chopin.
Yeah.
And I have a really nice picture of her, and she has her hand on the grave, and you can see she's really moved.
Wow.
And she was saying, whatever earthly remains of this person, they're here in this tomb, like all these years of playing this person's music, and I'm actually here where he was laid to rest. It's a big deal.
We had a wonderful time there in El Salvador, and that's a place I had played solo several times before. And I still have the newspaper clipping of when we visited that grave.
Oh,
the news was there and took our
that's right.
picture. And that was special. So many wonderful special things.
We got taken to the museum and we got to play on Barrios. We met the last surviving student of Barrios in El Salvador at that time.
That's
in
right.
his late 90s.
I don't remember his name.
Victor something.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like really a life of fulfilled dreams brought about by like a collaboration. Then you go on tour with these people that you get along with so well, and like we're doing now, you have these memories. It's not like the solo thing is great, but you sit and you say to yourself, hey, do you remember this time or whatever? But we've got colleagues that we can say, hey, remember the time, and oh, wasn't that funny? And
well, and I have to say,
share
I'm
the
really
load.
glad that you are still in the quartet. I had to retire because of some issues with my hands, and I remember at one point Patrick saying, I think I've had enough of the rigors of the touring and everything, and I want to compose, and so he retired, Dennis retired, and as each one of us retired, to find a wonderful replacement musician, still sort of in the family, still connected with Patrick's
that must
teaching.
be really nice too, because I don't come to think of it, I don't really think about it that much from the outside. What it must be like for you guys, well, probably a little part of you wants to say, I'd like it to collapse without me, but in general, you're probably really happy you can see this thing that you invented. Because it is, we can all take a lot of joy in what the quartet has achieved, the seven of us that have been in it so far, but it really is your idea.
Yeah, I'm very proud of, and I do remember having that feeling. Well, Patrick and I said, we were retiring, should the quartet end now?
Right.
It's been the four of us that have been so great, and I said, no, let's bring in some young players, and so you have moved from the youngest player in the group now to being the oldest.
And it feels like it happened in an afternoon, but yeah.
And it's very heartwarming to see how the success has even grown so much beyond. And I go and hear you guys play now, and the level is so impressive.
Well, the guys
are
Bruno, Julien, and Renaud are really impressive, and they're going to be really happy I said it, because we operate now almost like a hockey team. We're always ribbing each other, and like guys will, right? So, but they'll be happy to see it. I said it on record. It's what it's supposed to be. They grew up hearing the quartet, so the stuff that we that almost killed us playing from memory in the beginning, they take it not for granted, but they never question if it's doable or not. Because by the time they really started paying attention, we'd already been doing it for a few years.
Yeah.
And you know, all the student ensembles in our neck of the woods, they all play, and young professionals, duos and stuff like that, are all playing from memory and trios.
Yeah, it's
like
a
that
standard thing now.
It's kind of and it's, you know, the guitar being the guitar, it's kind of a nice thing. The trade-off is you don't get to do as much repertoire in a lifetime as, say, a string quartet would, because they can, you know, I've interviewed some string quartets, and they basically say, well, we've got the kind of position where we're a string quartet in residence, so they have, like, you know, a job with a pension waiting, but their job is to play in a string quartet. Not they do a little teaching on the side, but it's a side thing, and they rehearse every day. And when they start a new piece, they just open the book and they all start reading it together for the first time, and they just rehearse together. And some of them don't touch their parts outside of group rehearsals that much because they don't need to.
Yeah.
Everything they do is, I mean, you're playing single lines and you're so much more accomplished at reading than we are. And what we do is very, like, the comparison between a guitar quartet and a string quartet has its limitations because we don't exactly do the same thing.
I was always very proud of the fact that people could not always follow the lead part when we played. We bounce it around, we trade off, especially in Patrick's music, which is really written for us, and he knows exactly the strengths of every player, to have very complicated textures and yet the music coming through very clearly. But the bass line is constantly shifting from one player to the next, unlike in a string quartet.
Yeah.
And
well, again, like if
gave me a lot
we
of
go
pleasure.
back to the thing about wanting to emulate the Assads, when I see them in concert now, I've been, you know, a guitarist, I'm not befuddled by who's doing what. But when I was seeing them when I was in my, you know, mid-20s as a student, that was my thing, says I can hear everything that's going on, but I can't always tell which one of them played what I just heard, even by looking at them, you know.
Magic. It's
and
magic.
And that's what we sort of, when you get that kind of comment back, the comment that you've thought about your heroes, you hear somebody else say it about you. Boy, that's nice.
Yeah.
That feels really good.
Yeah. So I think the Canadian Guitar Quartet, to quote Patrick again, crown jewel of the career. But my career spanning this many years of solo playing, and then that international phase that got me to so many interesting places, and then continuing the international playing. A couple of things I think that are very important that we haven't talked about. One was with the quartet, the connection with Ben Verderay.
Right.
Really, again, some highlights working with him, even performing with him, and him having us at the Yale Summer School performing some of our best concerts, and to New York City twice to play. Again, some wonderful career highlights, and working with such a positive, spirited fellow, such a wonderful guitarist and composer, has been just a
and
total
we
inspiration.
don't get to see him anywhere, well, not right now with things in lockdown and all that, but we don't get to see him as much, but we do bring him to Ottawa when we can, just to get to see him, and we pick up right where we left off, have a great time, and, you know, if we have any, you know, questions, need of advice, he's there for us, and, you know, it's lifelong friendships that get started in these things, and they're just great.
I thought at one point that he had gotten us this wonderful gig we did in Chicago. It turns out he didn't. We got it on our own reputation, but that was another special one where we did two things that I was always very impressed with. One, we got to work with a dance troupe, and they choreographed one of Patrick's pieces.
Tango contre Tango.
Yeah, that was such an amazing experience to do that, and Carnaval with them dancing on a huge stage.
And that was
Chicago.
You know, this is 2008, 9, maybe something like that. Because it wasn't right at the end of Dennis's year. Because Dennis was being the first one to retire. He retired somewhere around 2010.
Okay.
Because the last tour we did with Dennis was the Mexico El Salvador tour, which was so much fun.
Yeah, that was 2010.
I mean, here's an ensemble that's been together for 11 years. The well-oiled machine of, like, the playing was just... The joke I always make is, you know, you're in the middle of playing, you say, I'm going to try to play a wrong note now, and you can't. You know? But No, the thing with the dance company, that was, so about 8, 9, something like that.
Must have been, yeah.
And that was broadcast to the internet. There was a simulcast.
That's right.
Apparently there was like a 10-second delay, so it was live.
Was that our premiere of the Beethoven third and fourth movements? It was early on.
It would be pretty early on in us playing it.
One of the most ambitious pieces that I was ever involved with. You guys now toss it off amazingly well.
Well, again,
in those days it was. Oh.
And my colleagues have worked their butts off to get it, but it's different when you. It's not that hard to play like Jimi Hendrix when you grew up hearing him, but for Jimi Hendrix to come up with that sound was something else, right? So, which is what allows the new guys in the quartet to take things to further heights, is they take the baton from the guy they're replacing and just carry it further.
But I look back and I think, wow, we pulled that off on a big stage, simulcast, internet. Yeah. And it was videotaped. It was in the library for many years in Chicago. Yeah. And very proud of that. And the other thing is the G8. You know, having...
Oh, yeah, that was, you know, one of these things where a project just comes out of this weird idea, and we get all, you know, ready, fly to Germany, never having met or even talked on the phone with the Salzburg Guitar Quartet. We are met at the airport, and 10 seconds in, it's love.
Yeah.
The 8 of us just adored being together so much. Like, time spent on the G8 tours was a bubble of just, like, you're in this bubble of love. Like, we just adored, like, my God, some of the funniest, most fun people to hang around with.
Yeah, we had 2 Germans in the group, 2 Austrians, and the 4 of us from the CGQ, and we wound up doing 3 European tours with them, and they did 3 Canadian tours with us over the years, and with one album produced as a result, but many radio broadcasts and interviews and master classes.
And 8 guitar is really fun too.
Yeah, so much fun, and so many great memories.
You know, though,
that.
it sort of brought me to the conclusion that 4 guitars is the maximum number of players where you really have to be, like, you can't have any mistakes because they're heard. Even at 5, there starts to be enough players that if things are perfectly tight, you don't really hear it as much. Mm-hmm. Like, 2 guitars playing out of sync is terrible, and 3 is terrible. At 4, you can so the 8, you never have. There's no way 8 guitars are always perfectly tight. It's just not. But they don't need to be. There's this massive sound. Like, there's no way, again, a huge symphony orchestra, the person seated to the furthest, because, you know, even just sound traveling, if there's 333 meters between 2 people, they're a second off from hearing each other, right?
Yeah.
So if you're 100 meters, you're a third of a second, and sometimes these big, so there's no way. But it's kind of off topic, but the 8 guitar, it was like, we didn't have the chance to rehearse as much, but the way it came together for the audience, it's not even an illusion. It's a perfect, finished, great playing product. But there's no way everything is really perfectly synchronized. But it doesn't matter.
It certainly comes across. We had an orchestral texture. Do you remember that at one point we went to Poland to play with the G8, and we gave several concerts. And then didn't we play with another guitar?
I wasn't on
octet?
That one tour.
Oh, you weren't on that tour. We did. So we actually had 16 guitars.
The Silesian guitar octet.
Yeah, they were an octet already, and we were an octet just when we got together. And so I think, again, it was like a mini guitar orchestra. It was this massive sound.
It's great. And I remember in the first German tour, I think it was the concert in Munich, where a friend, I think it was one of Reinhardt's friends, who had come from really far to see the concert. And so he said, I loved it and everything, but he said, even before I saw the concert, I thought to myself, when am I going to see 8 guitars? I'm going. And it was like a big, it was like, you know, it was either a drive or a train trip, but it was like lots of hours.
Yes, I remember that.
There's something about that. And I thought, yeah, that's true. There is something to it, you know?
Yeah. So things evolve. I mean, the Salzburg Guitar Quartet has disbanded, and the Canadian Guitar Quartet has just morphed into the you young guns now, which is wonderful to see. And so I sort of feel that that those were the highlights of my career, certainly. The college career, the early days winning competitions. I've now sort of I think I've just passed the 10 recording mark with different groups, Canadian Guitar Quartet, solo recordings, and then doing that CGQ work. And I still, and working at University of Ottawa is still a pleasure to teach there, and so I just look forward to more years. I'm with the Guitars Alive Guitar Quartet now.
Right, which I think is just, I can't get enough of the sound, you guys. The mix of, steel string acoustic, you on classical guitar, electric guitar and bass. Like there's just, it's like...
It's pretty unique, eh?
It's sort of, if you sort of explain it as maybe like kind of Chet Atkins playing with, a South American classical player or something, or there's overall, like it mixes, bluegrass, country, a little blues, certainly all the classical sounds and the Latin American stuff. It's just fantastic.
And our favorite thing as a group is to take one of these South American Latin tunes that I would discover on my touring solo years ago, and I have all this wealth of material, and I say, guys, what do you think of this tune? And I'll play them some Latin guitar solo, and they'll just start adding layers to it. And so now we're working on our third recording project.
I can't hear a recording of Cardoso's Milonga, a solo guitar version anymore without wanting to hear the slide guitar come in.
That's right. No, I can't. Yeah, I can't go back to the originals.
I go, wait, there's a part missing here.
Yeah, no, those guys add so much. So it's been a great ride. It's not over, but I appreciate sharing all these wonderful memories with you.
One of the last things maybe that we sort of didn't touch is in your performing career. I mean, we kind of mentioned it, but you really did play all over Canada, and you did a lot of concertos over the years with different orchestras too. Because, we used to have a joke in the early quartet years. Phil knows everybody. Hey Phil, did you ever meet that guy? Oh yeah, he plays on a rock in the middle of the desert on Tuesdays in this country, and I met him back at but you really like and it happens all the time in certain publicities. They'll use the tagline, "Have guitar, will travel," but that really does describe your years too.
I'm so grateful to have had that. When I tell people, you meet somebody on the golf course and they say, "So what do you do for a living?" And I say, "Well, I'm a musician." "Oh, what do you play?" "Oh, I play guitar."
Yeah.
And they immediately, invariably, picture, because they tell me, "Oh, so do you sing? Do you know all your chords?" And I said, "No, it's a little different than that. I've played classical art music, and I've been to a lot of countries." "Oh, wow,
it's something else." I mean, and one of the things that I like doing with these interviews is looking at, and I kind of got this from you a little bit when we do these group master classes. At the end, you'd have, Phil's wrap up, and says, "Well, notice what we talked about today," and there was no such thing as a high-level Canadian guitar quartet working in Canada at the time. A little bit of our model for starting it was the LAGQ, like
That's right.
This group that would come together with 4 solid players and expand the repertoire and look for and develop its own career. And it's the 4 of us who sort of said yes, but we also want to be a little bit more like the Assads in a way, from playing from memory and kind of repertoire. But then, so you said, okay, I'll found one. There was, no undergraduate degree in guitar at UBC at the time, but you kind of invented your own, and you had a teacher who maybe wasn't, giving you what you needed, but you weren't giving up the guitar. Like there's sort of just tenacity in loving the instrument so much. You weather whatever storm comes your way as long as you get to have your guitar in your hands.
Well, yeah, and I guess one final thought too that I
being
should...
pig-headed is good.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that that is important is our Canadian music, having played so much of Patrick's music in the quartet. But as a soloist, I remember one of the big things for me was always championing, is that the word? Canadian composers.
Right.
So there was the Weinsweig. I worked a lot with Walter Puczynski, premiered his guitar concerto.
Did you also... Am I remembering correctly that Weinsweig wrote something for you afterwards? Or am I confusing that with something else?
Well, yes and no. He wrote after Contrasts, which he wrote for Brouwer to premiere, and then I recorded it. He wrote his 18 studies what you call 18 pieces, but they're little studies. And I worked with him many hours going over the guitar details, the editing. We even talked about titles. And so they're sort of dedicated to me, but I don't think I was the original inspiration.
Right. Okay.
But yeah, working with him was always such a pleasure and an honor, really. And then working with Buczynski wrote a piece for me.
Right.
September edition was written for me to play a solo piece, and he wrote his concerto for me to premiere. And Stephen Chapman, another well-known composer who had actually been my fourth-year theory prof at UBC way back when I was an undergrad.
Wow.
Wound up writing a piece called Fleeting Thoughts that I premiered at another one of those Toronto festivals, and put on one of my CDs at a later date. So it's been a pleasure and a privilege to work with these composers and to contribute to Canadian music on the guitar.
Wouldn't you like to go back in time and tell the Philip Candelaria entering first year, like, just don't, like, you just keep playing it, you have no idea what's waiting for you, but it's going to be good.
Yeah, good note to end on.
Yeah.
Thanks, Louis.
Excellent. Thank you, Phil.
And that was the conversation with my friend and mentor, Philip Candelaria. Please join us again on the story of classical guitar in Canada. There's so much more to discover. Thank you.